Welcome to Canada Conversations, part of Delaware Debates 2014, produced by Delaware Public Media in collaboration with the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication. I'm Delaware Public Media's news director, Tom Byrne. This conversation, taped here on the campus of Delaware State University, focuses on the race for State Attorney General, and we are joined by Democratic candidate Lieutenant Governor Matt Denn. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with, I guess, the most basic of questions, which is, why have you decided to run for Attorney General?
I decided to run. It was a difficult decision for me because I'm halfway through my term as Lieutenant Governor, my second term, and Lieutenant Governor is the best job that I've ever had. I really enjoyed doing it. I feel like I'm getting a lot of things done on issues that were really important to me when I ran for that job, such as children's issues and small business. So when the opportunity came up to run for Attorney General, I needed to really seriously think about whether I would want to switch, because if I'm lucky enough to be elected, I would stop being the state's lieutenant governor. And ultimately, what caused me to want to get into the Attorney General's race is the violent crime problem in our state. This is the state where I was born. It's the state where I've lived for the last 25 years. And our homicide rate, while the rest of the country's has been going down, ours has been going up. And we're regularly now being ranked in all the types of polls that you don't want to be ranked in terms of our per capita rate of violent crime. So that's a problem that needs to get addressed. It's a tragedy for the families that are involved in the crimes. Obviously, there's really no greater tragedy than having a family member or a friend who's been involved in a homicide or some other violent crime. But even beyond the people who are directly involved, it really has an impact that goes far beyond that in terms of the well-being of the entire state, how our economy does, really how life is, the quality of life for everyone who lives here. So what got me into elective office in the first place is the opportunity to try to solve problems. It's something I think I've done pretty well since I've had the privilege to be in other elective office, and that's really the problem that I would be looking to solve in the Attorney General's office, and what really compelled me to get into the race.
What do you feel in terms of background and qualifications separates you from the other candidates?
Separates me from the other candidates? I don't really know the other candidates very well. I've met each of them briefly. They seem like nice people. So I can really only talk about myself. One obvious thing is that I've been in elective office for 10 years. So people have a chance to judge me on my record. I served 4 years as the state's insurance commissioner, and I'm very, very proud of the work that I did in running that state agency. Got an awful lot of things done for consumers and made an awful lot of changes that I think people on both sides of the political fence, Republicans and Democrats, view in hindsight now as having been very positive and very important. And then over the last 6 years as Lieutenant Governor, if people go back and look at the things I said I was going to do when I ran in terms of trying to advocate for kids, making improvements in some areas of our public schools, working on changes to help small business, I think if they go back and look, they'll see that I did those things as well. So I have a record that I'm very proud of that people can look at, and that's one difference. I guess the other difference is the breadth of my experience as an attorney. This is the Attorney General's office. I've been practicing law in Delaware for 25 years since I came back here from Yale Law School. Part of the time in the private sector, part of the time in the public sector. I've practiced in literally every single court in the state, from the Delaware Supreme Court right through the Justice of the Peace Courts. And I think if you look at where other attorneys in the state, where they are and how they're viewing this race, the president of the Delaware State Bar Association is supporting my candidacy. The president-elect of the Delaware State Bar Association is supporting my candidacy. A lot of the leaders of the legal community who have had an opportunity to see my work as a lawyer up front and close are supporting my campaign as well. So I guess that would be the other thing that I think would probably distinguish me, is just how long I've been practicing law in this state and the breadth and scope of the work I've done in both the private sector and the public sector.
Is prosecutorial experience necessary for this job? Is it important to this job?
I think the most important quality for an Attorney General is exercising good judgment. There has not been, in literally decades, an Attorney General who's actually gone into the courtroom to prosecute a case. But what the Attorney General does do and has to do is make decisions every day that have a very direct impact on literally everybody in the state. And that's, again, something that I've done for 10 years and where I think I have a very good track record, whether it was making decisions about pursuing a lot of consumer advocacy cases in the insurance department, as the chair of the Criminal Justice Council for the state over the last 5 years, making decisions about victims advocacy and putting more of our public resources into crime prevention efforts. Those are decisions that have to get made, and I think that's really what the Attorney General does and what's important, and the kinds of decisions that I'd be making in that office would really be trying to direct a lot of the resources and energy towards what I think the office's priorities ought to be, which, as we were talking about earlier, a major one being trying to get our rate of violent crime down, and there are a number of different components to that where you have to make those decisions to get that done.
And that's where I wanted to go next. Obviously, the violence level throughout the state, but particularly in Wilmington, as you mentioned earlier, is something that's troubling a lot of people. Are there some specific things, as Attorney General, you can do to address that issue?
Absolutely. I think there's really two parts to dealing with the violent crime issue, and the first is dealing with it from a traditional law enforcement perspective. I think that there is really a need for more of a multi-jurisdictional approach to dealing with the law enforcement situation statewide. But as you pointed out, there are some neighborhoods in the state where just statistically the rate of crime is much higher. We have to have multiple state agencies in those neighborhoods, and we know where they are. It's no mystery where a lot of the crime is occurring. Multiple state agencies in those neighborhoods, on the street, very actively engaging with people who are out on the street in those neighborhoods, taking away guns from people who shouldn't have them, taking away drugs from people who are on the street, and just as importantly, forming relationships with the vast majority of the people who live in these neighborhoods, who are law-abiding citizens who would like nothing better than to have their neighborhoods be safer. And you have to have that positive relationship between law enforcement and the people who live in those neighborhoods if those other things are going to work. But you have to have the people on the ground doing those things, and we don't have that right now in the neighborhoods where this crime is occurring. The Attorney General's office in Delaware is in a unique position to make that happen. It's one of the only Attorney General's offices in the country where there are no district attorneys, where literally every single criminal case is prosecuted through the Attorney General's office, and that puts the Attorney General really as the central law enforcement figure in the entire state, and it gives you the ability to bring agencies together and to accomplish all those things that I just talked about, and have a much more collaborative and aggressive and visible approach to dealing with the law enforcement part of it. So that's half of it, but it's only half. The other part of it is that there has to be a more concerted effort towards dealing with some of the underlying problems that lead to the crime rates in those neighborhoods. The fact that we have a serious substance abuse problem in this state that hasn't been adequately addressed. The fact that we don't have enough after-school and summer programs for some of our at-risk youth in this state. The fact that we have a very poor rate of recidivism. We have 2/3 of our inmates who are released from prison committing new crimes that land them back in prison within 3 years of being released. That's a very, very bad number, and a lot of the crimes that are being committed by those individuals. So those are all problems, each of the ones that I mentioned, that have been successfully dealt with to one degree or another in other parts of the country. We know some of the things that we need to do to try to address them, and some of them are resource issues. And so another thing that the Attorney General can and should do is to go down to Dover, to go to the General Assembly, and to tell the legislators that, as the state's chief law enforcement officer, that these are things that have to be invested in. They're not cheap. Some of them are really not very popular. Spending money on reentry programs for inmates is not a popular thing to ask for from the General Assembly, but it's the smart thing to do in terms of getting the violent crime rate down. And I think the Attorney General has to be, and I will be, very active in terms of going to the General Assembly and asking them to invest in those things. And that's something that I've done over 10 years in the other offices that I've held, and that I think that I've had some good success doing.
You mentioned children's issues a little bit earlier. How do you plan on addressing the state's ability to prevent crimes, dealing with the most vulnerable sections of the population, children, and then obviously the elderly as well?
I think there has been some good attention paid to crimes against children, both from law enforcement agencies, from schools, but there is more work to be done. One of the areas that I'm particularly concerned about is that we continue to get reports of children who are being abused or otherwise maltreated by people in positions of trust with respect to them, teachers, school officials, and others. So that is a particular area of focus where I think that we need to do, and where the Attorney General can bring some very specific suggestions as to how we can prevent those things from happening. It's very troubling to me as a parent, and I think to most Delawareans, to have this steady drumbeat of stories still in the newspaper where people in positions of trust, really with respect to high school students all the way on down to very young children, are taking advantage of being in that position. With respect to the elderly, I think there can be and needs to be a focus on crimes to which they are particularly susceptible, and those in many cases tend to be fraud cases, whether it's consumer fraud, healthcare fraud, Medicaid fraud, and the Attorney General's office, I think, doesn't yet have, but ought to have, the capacity to be able to deal very proactively with some of those problems in a better way. Medicaid fraud, just to give you one example, there are much better opportunities now than there were 10 years ago to use data mining and other types of computer-assisted analysis to really target healthcare and Medicaid fraud where it's happening and deal with it preemptively, but the office isn't yet at the point where it can take advantage of those new capacities. So that's an area where I think there's opportunities as well. There's a third vulnerable population we have, which is Delawareans with disabilities, where I also intend to have a heightened focus. And as with children and the elderly, that is a population that in many cases is uniquely vulnerable to particular types of crime, some of them the same as crimes against the elderly. And I think the office needs to have a very sharp focus on making sure that that population is protected as well.
There's also an area that's growing, and that's the area of cybercrime, identity theft, and other internet-related crime. What role does the Attorney General's office have there to kind of protect the population from that?
It has a very important role to play. Some of that role involves working with the legislature to make sure that the proper legal framework is in place so that people who are in positions of responsibility with respect to having access to people's personally identifiable information deal with it responsibly, so we don't have situations like we've had with some retail establishments in the recent past where in hindsight it wasn't being dealt with responsibly, and a lot of people had their identities stolen as a result. And then there's also obviously the prosecutorial side of it. If there are people who are taking advantage of people through cyber crimes or otherwise, those cases need to be dealt with aggressively, and the office needs to have the capacity and the expertise to be able to deal with those types of crimes, because in many cases they are new, and in many cases it requires some level of sophistication on the part of the prosecution to be able to detect them and properly prosecute them.
You talked about this a little bit before already, but I want to circle back and just talk about it specifically. Talk about the Attorney General's role in your mind regarding judicial reform, and I guess maybe more broadly, being active in crafting and advocating for policy changes.
I think it's an incredibly important role. The Attorney General is the central law enforcement figure in the state. So on both sides of it, whether it is advocating for changes that need to be made, whether it's letting the legislature know that it's working on some things in terms of bills that are being considered that might be damaging to law enforcement efforts in the state, that's an important role for the office to play. And third, and maybe what people recognize the least often, in terms of resource allocation, we are living in very lean financial times. There's only so many dollars that are available in Dover to spend on the whole spectrum of things that are important. And if there is not somebody down there with the General Assembly telling them we need to invest in substance abuse treatment, we need to invest in programs for kids in the summer and after school, we need to be investing in reentry programs so we don't have this constant merry-go-round of people coming out of jail and committing new crimes. Those things don't happen by themselves. There has to be somebody down in Dover who is knowledgeable, who's in a position of responsibility in terms of criminal justice, who is making that case, or those things just won't happen. So I think that is something that is a very important part of the Attorney General's job. In fact, I think it would be almost irresponsible of an Attorney General not to be attentive to that part of the job.
All right, Lieutenant Governor Matt Denn, Democratic candidate for Attorney General, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And you can find all of our candidate profiles and candidate conversations online at DelawarePublicMedia.org and DelawareDebates.org. Candidate conversations are taped at Delaware State University and are part of Delaware Debates 2014, produced by Delaware Public Media in collaboration with the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communications. I'm Delaware Public Media News Director Tom Byrne. Thanks for watching.